Hello, everybody. How's it going? Can everybody hear me okay? So I am going to be using a slideshow because we did have some good pictures and whatnot that were in and submitted. So I'm going to open that up for us. And then we will get started in just a second once I figure out the YouTube stream. All right. Let's see here. All right. So when I click over here, I assume that you all see these slides. Is that correct? This is my first live stream. Can you all see when I was over on the other page, the water issues slide? All right, let's try this. You
got the chat turned on?
Oh, you saw a list. Did you see the slide that said the downloads area, or did you see the actual water issues? And then my little logo in the corner and all that good stuff. How's it going, Beth? Hi, Jamerica. How are you? Hi, Denise. You're ready to go. Just a list of slides. Well, I wanted to show pictures. Let's see. Allow. This might have done the trick. I think I just did it. Nope. Let's see. All right. Well, with that being said, I'm just going to roll with it. And we are going to move forward without the... Hey, Elsa. Lots of rain too for you all. I think it's just the way the El Nino, La Nina siphons. I think we're supposed to have a lot more dust and everything this time of year from there too. All right. I'd really like to share these folks with you, or these pictures with you, because I feel like it demonstrates this so nicely. Oh, well, at least it'll give people time to log on anyhow. So let's see here. I got really close. I opened it up. I want to go to, I guess we could do that. Where I go here. No, it won't. Oh, well, that wasn't it. Ay. All right. I'll try one more time and then we're just going to move on. Allow. Keeps opening it up. Here. All right. So I am third generation here in St. Pete, and over the years, I remember when I was a kid, we used to get rainstorms every single afternoon, and we would definitely see a lot of in the summers, but this season has been exceptional, as I'm sure that's why most of you are logged on here. And I started getting a ton of comments and questions related to root rot, fungal and disease issues, how to help their containers dry out, and all of that. And so it wasn't enough really to do a YouTube because I've been lucky enough here that our property is high and dry. I'm dealing with some issues at a farm school that I work at. But I did not have good visuals to show you all examples. And so I wanted to just do a YouTube live to be able to talk through some of the questions. And hey, Gabriel, nice to see you. Naples. So the entire state has been affected by this. And I wanted to try to answer some of the questions that we saw repeatedly over the past couple of weeks because I feel like it's probably going to be helpful for many of you. And so we have Welly from, let's see, and someone else, Coxie7 from Bradenton, 9AB. And I posted a picture, if you all saw it, of a papaya, and its leaves were all wilted. But this is a mature fruit tree that's been doing great. And now all of a sudden, after the rain, the leaves are drooping, a little bit yellow and peaked. Clearly, the plant is unhealthy and unhappy. So it looks like this. What can I do about it? That is almost always going to be root rot after a large rainstorm event like we've been having. And this can be consistent rain over several days. This could be an inundation where we're getting a ton of rain all at once. But the point is, this root rot can be a very serious issue for your annual vegetables, but also for your perennials and your fruit trees, which I'm a huge annuals fan, but honestly, the perennials are the ones that we've probably paid more for, waited longer for, and all of that. So how do we help that plant as best we can? Unfortunately, there's no 100% foolproof way to do so, but there are some things we can do to help tip the scale in their favor. So the picture in particular that was submitted had tall grass grown up around the papaya tree. And so that created very dense coverage right around where the root zone of that tree was. And my recommendation was to remove the grass from that area if there was any mulch in that area, to pull that back as well. And basically, we're just trying to get the soil to dry out and evaporate as quickly as possible. Now, if there's standing water right after a rainstorm, that's usually kind of inevitable. But if it's there the next morning, 12 hours later, 24 hours later, and there's still pooling, puddling in and around that plant, you could have very dramatic and serious effects. So I would recommend just kind of digging a channel and trying to funnel away some of that excess water as best as possible. Now, this can be because the water table is too high and there's not going to be much you can do about it. But sometimes it could just be simply a low point in your yard and maybe, unfortunately, like poor planning or placement in the space. And so if you're starting to dig and the water appears to be draining out of the area, then that could be a viable option. But aside from clearing the area of vegetation, other vegetation and debris to try to get as much sunlight exposure to those, to the ground and the soil to help with evaporation, potentially, although depending on the water table, this may or may not work, funneling away some of that excess water. Those are basically the two recommendations I would have for any sort of root rot issues. If you do have containers and your plants are experiencing these issues, perhaps there's no drainage holes in the bottom, something like that, you could remove the entire plant from the pot. If soil is left behind, you can remove that soil, put in fresh soil that's a little bit more dry. Obviously, I would not do so until I put holes into the pot if that was the initial issue. Or perhaps there was in the drainage, holes got clogged, something like that. Remedy that situation. Ideally, put in a little bit less moist soil and then put the plant back into the pot. That can help a little bit with remedying root rot in your perennials and annual vegetables. The next question that was submitted was about bananas. And if you've grown bananas, you know that they are a water-loving plant. But that means that they like consistent water, not standing water. they're just as likely to have root rot issues as any other plant, and they do not tolerate standing water. So if your bananas are in that position, then you definitely will need to try to remedy the situation one way or another. Now, this was submitted by Christine, and I have a picture of me actually maintaining water in a system, but that's damp, moist mulch, not standing water. So if you have bananas in that condition, I would try the recommendations for the root rot because it's very likely to occur in the near future if you don't get some of that water drained away. All right. So Joe Strallen from St. Pete. What plants might make a comeback after all of this? And then Eat CRV asked, what are good Florida native plants that can handle major inundation? All of ours died. So the initial would be always wheat. I remember taking my permaculture design course, and my mentor and teacher told me I leave all fruit trees, no matter how dead I think they may be, 6 months in the ground before actually removing them. And I thought she was actually like, that seemed a little much for me. Like, yeah, sure, you give it a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two. But after that, there's no way it's going to come back. But I trusted her guidance, and I found that that is oftentimes the case. I've had it happen with a lemon tree. I've had it happen with mulberry trees, Jamaican cherry tree that I thought died. So even if you think your plants died, regardless of whether it's a fruit tree, a native plant, vegetable, I would give it a little time. Now, if it's an annual vegetable or a small herb and it doesn't bounce back within a few weeks, maybe it's safe to call it quits. But certainly with a perennial type scenario, a larger tree, shrub, something like that, I would give it a reasonable amount of time before saying it's dead. So don't give up hope there. Please be patient. And then for Zoo Florida, loquat tree, it looks pretty dead. If it was saltwater intrusion, that could potentially be a different scenario where that's a pretty sure bet unless you have a salt tolerant species, because it's not just a water inundation issue, it's changing the soil structure and biology. But even if it looks pretty dead, I would really, really encourage you. You can maybe prune some of the branches back if you really want to, but honestly, if it were me, from my experience and from my mentors have shared with me, leave it as it is. Just leave it. It'll be ugly. Just let it be. Give it at least a couple of months. And we are heading into winter, so it could potentially even be next spring. If you're patient enough, it's very likely that it will bounce back in the spring. That's when it's going to already be in that new growth cycle for most plants, not all plants. So as far as what you could potentially put in its place if you are looking to replace some plants that have actually died out, as ETRV asked, one that's medicinal and edible, and I already grow in my yard anyhow, is elderberry. Great one for marginal areas and for low-lying areas that can potentially get standing water. They can take standing water. Swamp milkweed is another native species. It's actually better than butterfly milkweed to have in your garden for the monarch butterflies, native milkweeds. Cardinal flower, Stokes aster, sweet shrub, swamp or scarlet hibiscus. Most of the hibiscus and mallow family plants are all pretty well adapted to wet conditions. Firebush is another one that's maybe a little surprising. It's quite tolerant in both directions. It does drought and moist environments, but it can take standing water. Muley grass, Fakahatchee grass, cordgrass. Cordgrass obviously will need consistent moisture. That is basically like salt marsh grass. But the other two are more ornamentals. You could also do, if you're looking to replace trees, bay, magnolia, cypress, and maple are all native species that would fill that niche. But I will say that some of those can take varying extremes. the elderberry can take extremes in either direction. The firebush, like I mentioned, they can take drought and standing water, but some of these species, they can take standing water, but they also want consistent moisture. So you may have to do a little bit of research when you're deciding what to put in the place, because we have had, depending on where you are in the state, exceptional amounts of rain. Tampa had a record-breaking amount of rainfall in the hour, time frame that they measure it by. So literally record-breaking year, which means that even though you're having some issues now, even though you got standing water in certain areas of your property, you have to ask yourself, is this the norm? Because planting for the what if means that depending on what you pick, you may have to maintain it for that condition. So some of these are going to need consistent moisture, which means, in our hot, dry spring, or if we aren't having quite so rainy of a summer, and it's something that actually needs standing water, you may be out of luck and that plant may die. So try to find that happy medium, do a little research, potentially if it is something that is not consistently been an issue for you in the past, maybe just find one that can take the extremes in either direction and go that route so that you're kind of cushioned on both sides. All right. So our next question came in. It was anonymous. Too much moisture in pots, and the statement, losing the butterfly garden and fruit trees to the rain. We are hoping to start pots from scratch. So pots, first off, whenever you're working in container gardens or pots, anything that does not have a hole in it is pretty much, in my personal opinion, off the table. They look pretty. They kind of sort of function inside in an indoor setting, because obviously you don't want water running across your floor. But I would much prefer you to have a pot with drain holes and a saucer underneath it, or something to catch that water, than no drain holes at all. Because when you have 0 drain holes in those pots, it is so easy to overwater and not realize it until it's too late. So if you have a pot without holes, just move on and find a different pot. If you are having these issues because maybe your pot's outside with all the rain and everything, and it still does have drainage holes, 2 pots tend to drain moisture better. So this would be a replacement again. But clay or terracotta, as well as the cloth fabric pots, both drain water very quickly and very well. They're both designed to remove extra or excess moisture from the soil. And so if this is a problem that you foresee again, or you've lost a couple of plants at this point in your container to this issue, then I would move into one of those 2 pot options. And then on the flip side, some people think, with the butterfly garden and everything, like, okay, I'm going to move from in-ground into pots. They can definitely help, but it's also not foolproof. You have to think about being able to get that drainage going. So using the terracotta or the fabric will help with that scenario. But, come spring and our hot, dry season, they can also be a handful to water. So it could be a seasonal thing where you break them out for the summer months and then switch to something glazed or plastic or whatever else you decide for the winter months, and the spring months, so that you can conserve moisture better. All of these answers aren't 100% solid, because it's going to depend on your environment and whether it's been a consistent issue for you, just a pop-up issue that you're trying to remedy at this point. So it's kind of a catch-22 either way. All right. So let's see, is putting rain covers over gardens realistic? Beth, I do not recommend covering your garden with plastic or other structures to try to keep the rain off, unless it is like a permanent structure. It is very, very easy for water to collect and pool in, say, like even if like those pop-up tent canopies that you would take to a beach. Certainly any sort of like plastic, the water pools on top of it. It's very heavy and it can very easily crush plants. So I do not recommend that as a solution to trying to reduce the water. It would just be remedying it after the fact. All right. So our next question comes from Lori Walker, Green, Largo 10A. One of my raised beds is a low spot where water has been standing each day after the heavy rains. Will that water be bad for the plants in the raised bed? Can I do anything to improve it? Hey, how's it going, Kissimmee? We got people all over the state, which is super fun. All right. So with our raised beds, it's not likely to affect your plants. With raised beds, one of the huge benefits to raised beds is that they drain and shed water well. That's actually one of the distinct characteristics about a raised bed. That's one of its pros. So the odds of it affecting the plants itself and the soil staying too wet for too long of a period is possible, but slim. What's more likely to happen in that situation where you have water pooling and puddling consistently around the edge of the bed, and since I can't show the slides because I'm not a tech savvy person, it was a metal raised bed. So it is way more likely that you're just going to see a deterioration of the metal at the base where it's getting that frequent inundation a lot sooner than the top of the bed. So the beds itself could see ill effects, but it is not super likely that the plants themselves will be bothered unless it's something like, too much humidity, so like fungal and that kind of thing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But as far as the plants dying from excess moisture in the soil is not super likely. All right, so let's see here. Our next question from Arbert, do we need to add more fertilizer to our beds from excess rain? And from Joe Salt, Spring Hill 9B, should you apply fertilizer after heavy rain? Does it get washed out or top dress with compost? So absolutely after our heavy rains, you very likely are severely depleted in nutrients. So yes, you do need to add nutrients back in. But if we are going to continue having torrential downpours for the next few weeks, in this case, maybe potentially another month before things start to dry out a little bit and we get more into our like winter, cooler-ish, dry-ish months. If we're going to continuously get these rains, there's kind of sort of no point in adding fertilizers, slow release fertilizers back into the garden beds yet. They will absolutely need to be replaced in probably higher quantities than you would have maybe topped off your beds had they not had these heavy inundations. So you will need to, if you need to get a filler in between that time frame. So let's say you still have okra in your garden bed or something that's still doing fine, but now the leaves are starting to show signs of nutrient deficiency. You could use a liquid fertilizer as an in-between holdover until you can work in some slow release fertilizers that will actually stay in the soil and do their job. Liquid fertilizer pretty much leaves the system as soon as it's used. So the plant takes up what it can through its leaves, its roots, and then most of that is gone. And that is always the case with liquid fertilizer. So you can use it as a Band-Aid, not fixing the underlying issue. You're still going to need to replace the slow release soil amendments in the soil once the rains slow down a bit. Now, if this is in a less intense rain season than we're having this year, and it was just like a one-off hurricane, and you don't foresee these like absolute torrential downpours continuing in the near future, and you want to add in some slow release fertilizer in those scenarios, then go for it. It's just not going to be something that you want to do if you see a lot more rain coming soon. Oh, perfect. You're here and on. So Rachel just asked, what liquid fertilizer do you recommend? There's a lot of different brands out there. There's a lot of different options. If it's a nitrogen deficiency, fish emulsion works really well for that. Down to Earth has some liquid fertilizers. That's one of my go-to brands, not affiliated with them or anything, but when I was doing my research, they are pretty conscientious about sourcing their organic materials, which is not always the case. So I like them as a company. But there's tons of brands out there. Neptune's Harvest is a good one. There's another one. I'm trying to remember the name. Any of those will do. Also, if it's not a fish emulsion, you can also do a kelp meal or a kelp fertilizer. That one's also a good option as well. That helps with micronutrients, and it also helps bolster against disease as well. You can also do something like a worm casting tea, which has lots of good soil biology in it. And then Jupiter Moho, I am going to get to the Puerto Rican. That ended up being an entire questionnaire slide, so I will circle back to that, I promise. All right, so let's see here. We talked about how to deal with fertilizer. So now let's talk about disease. From Laura Lee Britt, Valrico 9B. What's the best way to organically treat fungal issues that pop up during summer rains? And a picture of, hey, Anthony, how are you? Fig trees with rust leaves. So figs are definitely disease prone here, but lots of plants, vegetables, perennial fruit trees, and everything in between is going to get fungal and disease issues. We are a warm, humid climate, and so we are just very susceptible to a lot of that influence. And so a lot of organic websites and resources will suggest copper or sulfur. Both are reasonable. They are both organic, and especially in an outlier condition like what we're experiencing here with these heavy inundating rains that are not normal or regular use, then they're okay to use. If it's any sort of regular or frequent basis, I'm not a huge fan of them. They can build up into the soil, and they absolutely have been proven to affect soil biology. And if you've watched my channel, follow me on social, I am a very huge proponent for soil biology. So a one-off use, I am okay with using those. But the overall long-term picture, especially if it's a repeated use scenario, I would not recommend those. Now, something they have found to be effective, I think it was like 60 or 70% effective at removing the disease, and then repeated treatments continues to decrease its issues and prevalence. But milk and water, this is like university studies. So you would think that they would want to charge money, but literally milk from your fridge, 50-50 water and milk spray has been scientifically shown to reduce disease almost as effectively as all of these other chemical treatments. So in my opinion, not harming the soil biology in any way, shape, or form, almost just as effective. That's my go-to if I have any sort of fungal issues, whether it's a one-off thing or a regular treatment, although I don't personally regularly treat, but it is something to be definitely keep on hand. It cannot be, I've had questions before when I've recommended this, it can't be canned milk or evaporated milk. It has to be like fresh milk you would buy at the grocery store in the cold section. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't matter if it's half and half or whatever. There was no statements in the research that was done as to whether it needs to be whole fat, whatever, low fat. So that is my go-to for any sort of fungal issues. And something that kind of got asked but didn't is pest issues as it relates. Anytime a plant is stressed, whether it's too much water, too much sun, too little water, any of that, whenever a plant is stressed, they are more likely to get sick, which means they are more likely to get a fungal issue or a bacterial issue or pests even. It's your rundown, you're more likely to have issues. So Kathleen just asked about white flies using insecticide soap and rain isn't chasing them away. White flies happen to be one of those insects because they are so mobile and so fast. They will very quickly evacuate the area. And so you'll lose when like you use those insecticidal sprays, they will work on the eggs and sometimes the immobile nymphs, but they're pretty much completely missing the adult white flies, which means they'll just circle back and lay some more eggs. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. I don't love using insecticidal soaps for them because of that issue. I find a vacuum to do quite well and is rather satisfying. So like a little hand vac or a shop vac if you have one. is fast enough and strong enough to collect some of those adult whiteflies so that you can disrupt the cycle in tandem with those sprays, and that might help a little. All right, so let's see here. The next question came from Myra Pagan and Kissimmee. After the rains, my Puerto Rican black beans looked like this, and it kept spreading. What happened? I really wish I had the pictures to show you all. So her bean plant looked to be a very large before this happy vine, and now half of it, 2/3 of it is brown dead leaves, and there are stripes or what look like could almost be scrapes on the stems, and they're kind of like reddish brown in color, and there's like streaks all over the stems of the plant. And so that is, it looks, at least from the picture, to be anthracnose, which is a really common bacterial infection that we can get here. There's lots of different species of that. You'll often see it show up in tomato plants, especially in the spring months, as little tiny brown dots. Different species will affect different crops. But this is considered to be like a bacterial fungal disease. And so that milk water treatment that I mentioned prior would help. But with that being said, sometimes we just have to call it on a plant. And so if a plant is half died back from that and showing signs and symptoms over the entire plant, and it's an annual. Now, if it's a fruit tree, I might fight a little bit harder because you have so much vested in it, time and money in it. But with like an annual veggie, especially when we're already heading into the turn of seasons and we're heading into cooler winter crops, most beans, Puerto Rican black bean is actually technically an exemption from this because they can be weak perennials in South Florida. But when we're in a change of seasons already, I would just scrap the plant, honestly, at this point, because so much of it is infected and because we're at the turn of seasons. When you have a disease or fungal issue like this, it is best not to compost it unless you are 100% sure that you have a hot compost pile, which means 120 to 160 degrees for 2 to 4 weeks minimum. If you maintain those temperatures and you're confident you do so, you can compost it safely, and the heat will destroy the organisms. If you are not 100% positive, it is definitely best to just throw it into the garbage. So that would be my recommendation in this particular case. Now, Jupiter Moho had asked about Puerto Rican black beans as well, so I figured I'd just tie it in together. They're having issue with the curculio on the pods. They've been doing BT spray or just give up and replant in February, zone 10A. So with the curculio, they can be a real issue. They are hard to pinpoint and treat. The BT is on the exterior of the bean pods. And so if the mother drills the hole and lays the eggs inside, it's kind of like leaf miners. When we spray the outside, it's not really getting to them on the inside unless we're using a systemic chemical, which most organic chemicals, systemic means in the plant tissue and not just surface related or like contact related. It's not common in organics, and it's not very effective treatment. What I would say is my method, if you're not willing to remove them to completely break the cycle, is freezing. So what I'll do is I harvest the beans, dry beans, and I freeze them. And so I'll still have some losses if they got in there early and hatched out. I will lose some beans that way. But anything that is in there is killed. So like if they're in dry storage in in my pantry or whatever, they're not continuing to eat away at my crops. I do that with like rice and other stuff that I buy in bulk as well. It kills off any eggs and would-be larvae that are in there. So that could be a workaround for you. I know it's not like the most joyous of solutions, but it's a solution, and they can be quite troublesome to deal with. All right, so let's see. Anthony, when applying granular fertilizers to plant transplants, do you apply it in the hole around the planting area or both? If I am working my way into the soil and not like say direct seeding or something like that, and I'm putting a plant in, I sometimes my granular fertilizer is worm castings. And so that can't burn the plants. Depending on what fertilizer you're using, putting it in direct contact with the root zone can potentially cause issues. So depending on what you're using, it may or may not be advisable to actually put it in, or if you do, maybe cut half the recommended dose or something like that so that you are erring on the side of caution. I'm a huge fan of top dressing. It just allows nature to do the work for me. It disturbs the soil ecosystem less, and the nutrients still slowly trickle into the plant system as the plant needs it. So I usually go around the planting area unless it's castings, which are not it's incapable of burning the plant. And that's when sometimes I might add in an extra handful or so at planting. But to be quite honest, I usually uh, don't plan that far ahead. So it's few and far between when I do that. Sometimes I'll add in crab meal. I will add in crab meal for things like okra or tomatoes that are really susceptible to nematodes. I'll put those in the hole where the root zone is because one, it can't burn, and two, it's super slow to decompose. So you want to try to get it to where it's going to be most effective as quickly as possible. All right. So let's see. Denise Hagen from Flagler County, 9B, how to keep young seedlings from dying from damp rot. So damp rot or damping off is an issue, a fungal issue again, with young seedlings. Because of how it is spread, it's not like a spray is going to help that plant come back. Like we were talking about the milk water sprays or something like that. It affects the seedlings too quickly, and there's not usually a recovery. Usually once they get damping off, you're done and you'll lose your seedlings. So if that's the case, and you've had issues with damping off, I would look at a few different things. One, your seed source. So if you're buying it from a seed company or a reputable seed source, the odds of it having issues is probably slim to none. But like, let's say you save seed yourself or you got it from a neighbor or something like that, not encouraging you not to do those things. It's just something to be aware of. It could potentially have that bacteria in the seeds itself and would then be there as soon as they're sown to affect your crops. The other thing that you could potentially look at if this has been a consistent issue is the soil itself. I'm obviously a huge fan in soil biology and soil ecology, but when we are starting seeds, a sterile seed starting mix is incredibly beneficial because if it's sterile, all of that bacteria has been killed off. And so there's very very little risk of getting damping off. Now, there's going to be some in the environment and stuff like that, but you're not going to have this explosion. As soon as the mixture gets wet, it's going to be something that kind of comes in, and hopefully your seedlings have gotten past that initial germination stage. That's the only time that damping off will affect your crops. So if you have if you buy any sort of like labeled designated seed starting mix, it's very likely already sterile. But if you're wanting to be sustainable and do everything yourself, you could potentially use your own compost, which typically does not make good soil starting because it is so biologically active. It's very likely that there is that damping off bacteria in there. You can literally, sterilizing, it just means heat. So you could literally bake your compost to do your seed starting mixes in if you've had damping off as an issue. It doesn't smell the best, but you just put it on the lowest setting for your oven until it dries out completely. And that will create a sterile seed starting mix for you. Worm castings are what I use. Worm castings are biologically active, but they're also incredibly good at removing harmful bacteria. It's I think it was like 90 to 95% effective at removing foodborne illnesses and bacteria from the food items that go in. So they're very efficient digesters. So I like to use worm castings as my seed starting mix because I do stuff in-house and I try not to buy in anything if possible or very, very little. Um, so that's something to consider is if you do have a worm bin, that could be an alternative that is generally not sterile, but not likely to have the damping off issue. All right, so let's see here. Do we have another? Rachel Burt asked about, do you add the fertilizers, worm castings, green sand, etc., to your amended soil prior to planting or topping off a bed? So I do have an entire YouTube video on how I amend my soils, but generally, as a quick blurb, what I usually do is there's almost always going to be some settlement and some soil erosion, although it's just the plants using up the food and all of the decomposers further decomposing the soil. So it's not necessarily erosion usually, but kind of that concept. So usually there's a couple inches or whatever of soil that have to be topped off. And so whether that's bag soil or bulk soil or compost or whatever you have available, what I usually do to create like a no-till system is that I will put in any sort of fertilizers or soil amendments, slow release fertilizers, worm castings, green sand, whatever you want to put in there. I usually put that in on the soil surface that's there. And then when I go to top off the soil with that couple extra inches of compost or purchased soil, I'll put that on top. And so that's basically working it in a little bit lower than it otherwise would have been. It'll be slightly protected from like sun beating down on it, that kind of thing, but you're not actually disturbing the established soil ecosystem. So that's my general approach to adding fertilizers to the raised beds or containers each season. All right, we got a few more questions here. Looks like 3 more. So the Balance Babe, Lakeland 9B, can you prevent plant splitting from too much rain? From Elizabeth, Ormond 9B, how do you keep watermelons from splitting? You can't. Unfortunately, especially like, I mean, when you get 7 to 12 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, hopefully the watermelon is either too immature and it is able to move through it, or it was close enough to ripe that you could just pick it ahead of time. If you know that there is going to be an extreme rain event in your area, whether it be a tropical storm or a hurricane or one of these deluges that they're predicting substantial rain from, or if it starts raining and you can just tell like this is going to be a big one, go harvest the watermelon before it has time to take in all that extra moisture. If it's close to ripe, it'll still taste plenty sweet. We've had several split where my daughter was like near tears, and then she's like, "Oh, it still tastes like a watermelon." I'm like, "Yeah, we're good. It's all good." So if it's close, harvest it. There are varieties that are less likely to crack. So if this has been a repeated issue for you, or you want to grow them in the summer and not like the curb season, like spring and fall, depending on where you are in the state, you can plant one of those varieties. Sugar Baby's one that's known to be fairly crack resistant. Also tends to be the smaller icebox watermelons they're just like tomatoes. So like a large slicer tomato, it takes longer for them to grow. So the likelihood of one of those rain events happening in that time frame is a lot higher, right? So it's the same concept with the watermelons. If you use an icebox watermelon, which is a like small, like single serving or a slightly larger, but not like those giant ones, if you do those, they have less growth time. And so it's less likely for that rain event to occur. So just something to keep in mind that way. And then as far as drainage when you're planting, it's not necessarily a fix for after. Once you're in it, you're kind of in it. But I always plant my watermelons onto mounds on top of my raised beds. So like in my normal raised bed, here's my soil. I will actually build a little mountain on top of my normal soil level. And then I put my seeds at the top of the mountain. And that gives it just a teensy bit of extra drainage and can sometimes tip the scale in your favor for that splitting and cracking of the melons. All right. So let's see here. Our next question, Sherry Lynn. How to control ants in the raised beds. Most ant control stuff you can't use unless it's dry with daily rain. They are struggling to stay dry too. So I assume it's probably diatomaceous earth is a really common pest control. It is very effective when it's dry. It is not dry right now. There are different ant bait stations you can use. Orange oil, especially if it's only like a small, like if there's a colony in one raised bed or something that just won't move out. I have another YouTube video, an entire video on using that. Orange oil can help to move them along. When it comes in direct contact with the ants, it will, their exoskeleton breaks down, so it will kill on contact. And then the residue that is left behind is a deterrent. And so you will almost always see the entire ant colony move locations. You can't pick where they move to, but if I do it sometimes once or twice or 3 times in a row, they'll eventually move to a place where I don't really care about. They're no longer in my bed. They're no longer bothering me, type of thing. So that's a very cheap method of doing that. A bottle of orange oil costs, I don't know, $3 to $5, and it'll last you for like years. So that's something to think about if that is an issue for you. Let's see here. So then we have, one thing to think about though with that, if you don't watch the video after this, it can burn your plants. So you do not want to, not the root zone. It's like a sun thing. It's oil, just like if you were to use any sort of like oil-based pest repellent sprays, anything like that. If you get it on the leaves and we have sunny days, it can burn the plant. So just when you're using the orange oil, be mindful, keep it at the soil level in the root zone where the ants are not on the plant itself. Even if the ants are on the plant, their colony is not on the plant. It's at the base in the soil. So that's where your focus should be. All right. So Frazzled Mom 3, first up, should you wait to harvest again? And Sandy Bush. The city unleashed 1,000 gallons of sewage water in my neighborhood. I feel I have to pitch everything growing, but I'm not sure about planting my fall garden. Any thoughts? This is a potentially delicate subject, or potentially not delicate. It can be a very serious issue. If it's leafy green, it comes down not necessarily to the next growing season. Almost always those issues are resolved when the flood waters are receded. You should be fine. You can send in soil tests to confirm, just for peace of mind, to make sure those bacteria are not present in the soil. But if it came in direct contact with the water and you're trying to look at vegetables that you have now or produce that you have now, if it's any sort of leafy greens, anything that we are actually consuming, root vegetables that came in contact with that water, toss it. It is not safe to consume. If it is a fruit, like a tomato or something like that, the recommendation is 90 days after the flood event. That's a long time. That I think tends to be a little bit on the cautious side. But that is the official recommendation, is 90 days. If you're an organic grower, you have to follow those things, that even animal manure, like cow manure or pig manure or whatever, if it's applied to the fields, depending on what part you're harvesting, they have certain days that they are legally required to not sell that produce. So that's the official recommendation. Depending on your comfort level and whether you think the sewage was just in the area, or if it was known and confirmed, if it touched those plants, or if it was just in the area, that is completely up to you. A lot of people will just they'll wait several weeks. Anything that, leafy greens and stuff that did come in direct contact is gone. But if you have a raised bed that had, tomato plants or okra plants that are several feet up in the air, that kind of thing, a lot of people will still continue to harvest from that. They'll just be much more thorough with their cleaning and washing and also cooking it. So rather than eating it raw, you're boiling it, you're sauteing it, you're cooking it in some form or fashion. The heat is an extra cautionary step and can make sure that won't be an issue for you. So those were the questions that were submitted. I see Joyce asked about some tomatoes inside, just put them in larger pots to go strong. Can I leave them outside now to grow instead of leaving them inside? So yeah, you can ready once they're potted up and everything and they have several true leaves, you can move them outside. Slowly, still hardening them off. I also have a video on that. We're over 120 videos now on the channel, all on tips like that and photo-based vegetable gardening. So if you're new to the channel, definitely snoop around a bit and do that. If you have any other comments, this will be posted afterwards in the feed. And I don't always check comments, but I will for the next 24, 48 hours or so. I'll try to stay on top of that, after which I probably won't be checking very regular. It's just too much to keep up with. But hopefully this was helpful for you all. I know this has been some crazy rain. But regardless of whether it is in the summer that we're doing this and we've had exceptional rains, or whether it's next season and you're dealing with the hurricane that moved through your area, whatever the case is, rain is part of growing. It is something that we have to get used to. And a lot of people are thinking in extremes, or you can't, it's easy to think in extremes, but we have to remind ourselves that nature is cyclical. It always is. There are always going to be rainy years, dry years, and everything in between. It's just kind of part of it. Working with nature, we can't control everything as much as we try. All right. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope you all have a beautiful night, and I hope we get to connect again soon. Oh, Anthony, have your worm bins changed since your bathtub video a couple of years ago? If there's been a newer video, there's not. That's still the system I use. It's worked great. I haven't had to make any changes. The only change, the plywood lids that I used were getting damaged and warped, and rather than buying new plywood, I have a friend that has a CNC machine shop, and I just had him use Starboard to make me lids so that it's a permanent fix rather than another temporary one. All right. So that's the only change, Anthony. All right. And I am going to go ahead and log off now, and I hope you all have a beautiful night.
Hey,